So let's take a quick look at the genetic basis of disease. So before we begin, it's important for you to realize that when you look at what the underlying etiology or cause is of the majority of diseases, you find that they are due to a complex interaction between the environment, whether that be the external or internal environment, and your genetic material. So it's this complex interplay between the two. This was known as the nature versus nurture debate many years ago, in which scientists used to say, well, is it nature that plays the biggest role at causing diseases? So is it your DNA? Is it who you are to begin with that plays the major defining role? Or is it nurture? Is it the environment that shapes our disease states? Well, like I've stated, now we realize that it's not nature versus nurture, that it's nature via nurture. And it's an interaction between the two. Whatever your genetic background is, that lays as a background to what's happening in the environment. And the environment can influence your disease state on a background of genetics. So what I want to do today is I want to push the environment to the side, and I just want to focus on the genetics and the genetic basis of disease. So what that means is, to begin with, we need to talk about DNA and we need to talk about inheritance very quickly. You know that DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, sits within the nucleus of all our cells. Well, all our cells except our red blood cells. So if I were to draw a cell with the nucleus, you know that the DNA sits within this nucleus or kernel or nut of the shell. Now, if I were to take DNA in its linear form, so as a very long strand, and I were to hold up one end and hold it up as high as I can, approximately a bit over 2 meters, that would be the length of your DNA. From up here all the way down to the ground, about 2 meters in length. Now, that's a lot to stick into the nucleus of every single cell of our body. So how do we get it in there? How do we pack it in there so nicely? Well, you'll find that the DNA is held together in a compact form called chromosomes. And so if you were to have a look under an electron microscope at the DNA, you would see that inside the nucleus of our cells, we actually have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, these chromosomes, I'm sure you'll see, look a little bit like this. Now, we're not going to focus too much on the anatomy of a chromosome, but you'll find that there's going to be a pair of chromosome 1, a pair of chromosome 2, a pair of chromosome 3, and so on, all the way down to 23 pairs. Now, once we get to the 22nd pair of chromosomes, from 1 to 22, they are known as our autosomes. And I'll talk more about this in a sec. Autosomes. Number 23 is known as our sex chromosomes. It is the 23rd chromosome, or 23rd pair of chromosomes, that define our genetic sex. So whether genetically we are male or genetically we are female. For example, if we have a look at that 23rd pair, if we see that one is an X and one is a Y, that tells us that genetically we are male. If we find that for the 23rd chromosome that one is X and the other one's X, that means genetically we're female. So we have pair 1 to pair 22 are called our autosomes, and our 23rd pair is known as our sex chromosomes, and that defines our genetic sex, whether we're male or female. And when it comes to inheritance, so when we inherit a disease, okay, or we inherit a gene that is mutated or has a change in it that increases our likelihood of getting a disease, where does it come from? So we inherit these 23 pairs of chromosomes from our parents, okay? That's why they come in pairs, because you'll find that one of them, generally speaking, comes from mum, and the other one comes from dad. And that's for all the chromosomes. So for chromosome 2, one comes from mum and the other one comes from dad. Same for chromosome 3 and so forth. So if we inherit a disease from chromosome 1 to 22, it's called autosomal inheritance. If we inherit a disease that lays on one of these sex chromosomes, well, that's called predominantly X-linked inheritance, because this Y chromosome that males have is a pretty pathetic looking chromosome. There's not much sitting on it. So you find the majority of sex-linked diseases, meaning those that are coming from that 23rd pair, are found on the X chromosomes. And I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so let's have a look at inheritance. Let's take chromosome 1 and let's just say you have chromosome 1, and remember it's a pair because one's come from mum. Again, generally speaking, it's a bit more complex than that. And the other one comes from dad. Now, remember, this is tightly bound DNA. And you know that if I were to take a small segment, so let's say we were to have a look at this segment here on the arm of chromosome 1, and we look at the exact same one on the other chromosome 1. What you'd find is that there's going to be a stretch of DNA. Looks like a strand of DNA like this. So let's have a look at it from mum as well. Strand of DNA. So you'll find that there's going to be a strand of DNA, and you know that DNA is made up of 4 individual base pairs: A's, C's, T's, and G's. Adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. And they look like they're in a random order. So you may find it says A, T, T, C, G, A, T, T, G. Now that just looks like a random line of nucleotides or base pairs. But in actual fact, what you'll find is there are some segments of DNA. Now there's 3 billion of these nucleotides in your DNA. But if you'll find that there's short segments of DNA, and that a short segment that can encode for a protein is called a gene. So let's just say that this short segment of DNA, which we'll call gene A, encodes for a protein, that allows for your red blood cell to look nice, round, and plump. Okay? So that's a red blood cell. So this gene encodes for a protein that allows for your red blood cells to function properly as a nice, round, donut-looking red blood cell. So what do we see? Well, we see that we get one gene, A, from dad, and we also get a gene A from mum. So mums will have A, T, T, C, G, A, T, T, G. It's exactly the same. So that means we get 2 identical genes, one from mum, one from dad. Okay? And we express, most of the time, both of them. What does that mean to express them? Well, it means if I express gene A from dad, I express and make that protein that allows for nice, happy, functioning red blood cells. The same goes here for the gene A from mum. I'm going to have a nice, fully functional red blood cell that can pick up oxygen easily. Okay, so if you have a look at your DNA and you'll find, and you have a look at those 2 genes, if they are identical, like they are in this case, you are known as being homozygous for gene A. Homo meaning same. So if they're identical from mum and dad, you're homozygous for gene A. Now, let's say that you inherited from dad a gene A that instead of this G being there, it was a T. Okay? Now, mum's normal, or I should say wild type, not normal, because there's never a normal in genetics. So mum has the wild type, which is the consensus sequence, what the majority of people have on the planet. and dad has a change here. Now, what you'll find when it comes to these genetic changes is the majority of them make no difference to the function of the protein, the majority of them. But some do make a difference. Let's just say that this one here inactivated this protein, okay? It stopped this protein from working properly. That means that we do not create a nice red blood cell. We create a red blood cell that looks not very good, okay? Well, what do we get? We get an inheritance pattern in which dad has given us a dysfunctional gene and mum has given us a functional gene. Now, let's just say that this from dad resulted in a loss of function. Now, if it's a loss of function, that means protein doesn't work. If you have a loss of function mutation or genetic change, have a look what happens. Loss of function from dad, but a fully functioning one from mum. That means that the one from mum is enough for us to function properly, okay? Now, what does that mean with inheritance? Well, what does it mean for disease? If this is me, and I've inherited this sort of pattern, it means that I am a carrier, okay? I'm a carrier. So this gene A wouldn't be known as gene A, would write it like this, just to denote that it's the mutant version, okay? So I'm a carrier. If I were to have a look at my genotype, which is the genetic profile, I would be little a, big A, okay? Now, if, like before, that T was not there and it was a normal G, what would it be? It would be little a and little a, okay? But in this case, I'm a carrier and I'm little a, big A. But that means I don't present with the disease because the gene that I'm getting from mum is fully functional and is enough for me to function appropriately. Okay, what if mum passed on that mutation as well? Well, that means that I am now big A by genotype. And that means that this doesn't work either, and it's a loss of function. Now what happens? Now I present with the disease. When you present with the disease from a genotype, it's called a phenotype. So think physiology, phenotype. The genotype is your genetic profile. The phenotype is how you present it physically or physiologically. In this case, 2 loss of functions resulted in the disease. What that means is, in order for me to present with a diseased phenotype, in this case, I needed 2 dysfunctional copies. This is known as autosomal recessive inheritance. Autosomal recessive inheritance, meaning I needed 2 dysfunctional copies to get the disease. Okay? You can have a look at, when it comes to inheritance patterns, how likely it is for offspring to get a disease if it is a recessive inheritance pattern. So let's have a look. So for example, let's just say that I've got mum is little a, and dad is little a. What is the likelihood of getting a disease? If mum's little a, dad's little a. Well, that's the child here. That, next offspring. Every one of the children do not contain the dysfunctional gene, and they're all fine. Okay, what if mum carried that dysfunctional gene? Okay, she's a carrier, which means she didn't present with the disease, right? She needs 2 copies to present with the disease. Well, AA. What do we have here? We've got 2 children that are carriers. Again, not presenting with the disease. Okay, what if Mum's a carrier and dad's a carrier. The scenario that we just showed. What do we have? We have one child's not with the disease, the other child's a carrier, another carrier, this child's presenting with the disease. So there's a 25% chance. If dad's a carrier and mum's a carrier, there's a 25% chance in a autosomal recessive inheritance pattern that the child will present with the disease. Now, not all autosomal diseases are inherited recessively. For example, not only autosomal recessive inheritance patterns occur when it's a loss of function change. So meaning that this change results in a protein that doesn't work anymore. But what you'll find is some changes, actually exacerbate the protein or make it work differently. So for example, like I showed before, instead of losing the function, what you find is that you get a changed function. So now this red blood cell, or let's just say we make too many of these blood cells, it's changed the function. We call this a gain of function. And sometimes this can be dangerous and result in a disease. Now, what if from dad we get this mutation that results in a gain of function, and mum we get that nice, happy, healthy protein? Well, in this scenario, this gain of function overpowers this, and all you need is a single copy to present with the disease. This is called autosomal dominant inheritance. Autosomal dominant inheritance. So that means I only need to inherit one copy to get the disease. So if we were to draw up that same little table before, in which we've got dad, mum, and let's say dad is little a, big A, mum is little a, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to get little a, big A, little a, big A. And remember, all you need is one copy. Remember, in the autosomal recessive inheritance, these two offspring would just be carriers. They wouldn't present with the disease. But because this is autosomal dominant, they only need one. So this child and this child present with the disease. So that means in an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern, with a parent that contains one dysfunctional copy, you have a 50% chance of having offspring with the disease. So what type of diseases are autosomal recessive and what type of diseases are autosomal dominant? Well, autosomal recessive, diseases include diseases such as sickle cell anemia, Tay-Sachs disease, and cystic fibrosis. What that means is, in order for an individual to present with these diseases, they need a dysfunctional copy from mum and a dysfunctional copy from dad. Otherwise, if they only get one from one parent, they'll be carriers. So what are some autosomal dominant diseases? Well, there's one major one that I want to bring up, and that's Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease, all it requires is, it's not a single change like here in Huntington's disease. What you'll find is that the DNA has a strange thing. You'll find that there's many DNA repeats, and there's one repeat which is called a CAG repeat. Now, normally we have a couple of these CAG repeats in the Huntington gene, but some individuals will have upwards of 23, 33, 43 copies. And so it says CAG, 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 dozens of times. And if this happens over a certain number, this particular gene called the Huntington gene becomes dysfunctional. And you only need one copy. So it doesn't matter from which parent it comes from, you only need one copy of this CAG repeat in order to get the disease Huntington's disease, which is a neurological disorder. All right, the very last thing I want to talk about is sex-linked diseases. So this is those diseases that are inherited from chromosomes 1 to 22, what I've just drawn up. Now I want to show you diseases that are inherited through the sex chromosomes, XY or XX. So let's just, and this will take 2 minutes. So, remember that if you are genetically male, so your dad, he's going to be XY. And if you're genetically female, so from mum, you're going to be XX. Like I said before, the majority of sex-linked diseases are not on the Y chromosome, but are on the X chromosome. So let's just say, what happens if dad has a change here, a mutation on one of the arms of his X chromosome, but mum doesn't? Well, what you'll find is that because dad doesn't have another copy of the X chromosome, it's likely that even if it's a recessive disease, dad will present with the disease. Because remember, in recessive diseases, you got one gene that's dysfunctional, but the other one's normal and can make up for it, make up for the dysfunctional one. But here, males, genetic males, do not have another copy of the X chromosome. So all it takes is one dysfunctional arm or one dysfunctional gene in the X chromosome for them to present with the disease. How does the offspring work? Well, dad, mum, so you can have XX, XX, and that means one of the X's will have the mutation. You can have XY, you can have another XX, and you can have another XY. Hence why it's approximately 50-50 chance that you get males and females, because what do we have? Female, female, male, male. So what do we see here? We see that if the father contains a dysfunctional gene on the X chromosome, that X chromosome will always go to the daughters, never the sons. Why is that? Because the sons must get their Y chromosome from dad, because there's no other option. Okay? So what happens now? If dad presents with the disease here, and then passes it on, well, the daughters have a dysfunctional gene, but from mum, they've got a normal copy, which means the daughters are carriers. Okay? What if the mother had the mutation? Well, if the mother had the mutation, what you'd find is that you get XX, XY, XX, XY, this one here, XX, has the mutation, and this one here has the mutation. So what we find is that if the mother contains the dysfunctional gene on one of the X chromosomes, that 50% of the daughters will be a carrier, 50% of the sons will present with the disease. So this is the genetic basis and an oversimplified version of the genetic basis of disease and inheritance.